Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Smart Talks by the Elizabeth Smart Foundation. I'm Elizabeth Smart, and I'm here with my co-host, Mio Strong, and we're very honored today to have Thomas Wadleigh with us. He is a clinical mental health counselor, and today I'm very interested in talking about internal family systems. So, Tom, what are internal family systems?
Well, first of all, I think with internal family systems, it's kind of the name of the method of doing therapy is a little confusing because people might think of it as family therapy when actually it's individual therapy. And it was discovered by a fellow named Richard Schwartz about 35 years ago. He was a family therapist, and he had just gotten out of graduate school with his PhD, and had felt like I was listening to a tape this morning of him, and he was saying he thought family therapy was like the holy grail of therapy, and he had set out to prove it, and that individual therapy was really a waste of time. So to prove it, he created a study of 30 people that had eating disorders, bulimic clients, in their families, and he tried applying family therapy methods to that. And his main method was to try to control people from their binging and eating, and he had no luck at all. He just couldn't do it. And so he started asking them about their experience, and what they said was that a typical description of what happened was they would get together, and through the different things he was trying to do to control it, they would end up eating anyway. And they said what happened is that they, during the week, they would have this experience of just something happened, something made them insecure, made them feel bad about themselves, and then inside they start to hear like some self-talk going on, very critical, very, very critical talk that would blame them for all sorts of things, and there's something wrong with you, and so on. And then all of a sudden what would pop up would be the urge to go eat, and they would go binge, and they'd immediately feel better. Then of course they finish the binging, and then the critical voice would come back and start saying those horrible things again to them, and they'd start to feel horrible again, and the urge to binge would come back, and they'd eat again. And then they repeat this, kept happening. And so he started thinking, well, we got a kind of a vicious cycle going on here. It's almost like there's almost like different people inside of them talking to them. Somebody that's a critic, somebody that's feeling very discouraged, somebody that's got this idea of how to make it go away. And so he initially thought that they had maybe multiple personality disorder. But then he realized when he looked inside of himself, he also had conflicted experiences around eating. Not maybe as bad as they did, but he had that. And so he tried, but he didn't drop all the family therapy type methods with it. What he did was he thought, this is individual therapy, so I need to apply individual methods. So he tried things like controlling techniques for controlling the person, for coercing the person, applying logic, various things, and that sometimes he was successful in doing that to the point where the person would leave the session and say, yes, I'm definitely committed. So there'd be this committed piece inside of them and say, yes, I'll definitely do what you say. And they come back the next week having done the same thing again. And one of the people that, this was sort of an epiphany for him, is that one of the people was a person who had an eating addiction plus had suffered sexual abuse. And along with the eating, she would cut herself.
Oh, gosh.
And yeah, so she would cut herself. And so he used this coercion controlling method with her. And for a couple hours, he said one time, and the person went out of the session totally committed to not doing this behavior. And he said the next week, and this has been going on for weeks, the next week she came back and she had a gash in her face. And he said it just was so upsetting to him that he just kind of gave up. He just said, I can't beat you. I can't beat you. And to his surprise, something inside of her says, well, I don't want you to beat me, you know? And he started feeling like I'm actually feel like I'm talking to that part that does the cutting, you know? And he said the epiphany for him was he became curious rather than being coercive or controlling, uh, rather than viewing this part sort of like it's a resisting part, a resistant part of the person, which therapists typically struggle a lot with. I got this resistant part. If that wasn't there, everything would go better. He just he gave up and he was just curious about, well, why do you do this? And the part started telling him why it did it. It was to protect her, along with other techniques she had to get away from the abuse that happened way back when she was a little girl, when she got abused sexually. And the part said that it finally felt listened to rather than trying to be made to go away or try to be controlled or coerced. And she started spontaneously crying and telling about her story. And he learned about other parts that had done other things to try to protect her. And this gave him the notion that, this is sort of like a family, you know what I mean, of parts inside of this person. And what seems to be working is letting them, just like you would in family therapy, going around and letting each member of the family have a chance to speak up. And if you notice one of them getting upset, you turn your attention to the one that's upset and be curious about it and show some compassion. And he found that when he did that, there seemed to be some rapport happening between him and these parts. And that once they started to get calm and quiet and trusting and feeling listened to, something happened inside of the person herself. And what would happen is what showed up inside of the person herself was his own feeling, sort of like his feelings of being calm, curious, connected, compassionate. And this is where the healing would happen, is when the person's parts within her would realize that they had within them an innate, evidently grounded, centered part that could lead them and help them. And so that's how healing happens. So he called it internal family systems, because in a way he's using like family therapy on the various parts that he discovers and finding out how they all interact and how they work against each other, and then how he can help them to listen to each other and see that they all basically have the same benevolent intent of trying to help the person, take away, either avoid pain or not go overwhelmed with pain. So it's a really big deal. It's a change in the way therapists view how they're working with their clients. He said that he was hoping that this method would be useful for clients who basically therapists give up on. They give up on them and they just say, well, they've got a resistant part and they just don't want to change, And so they say, like, best I can do is just help them to live with this, because this is the limit of what they can achieve, And his philosophy was, that's not true. It's that this can help those parts that are injured be able to finally feel listened to and let go of their techniques of keeping the person safe. That's why they got the name internal family systems. It's a very hopeful way of therapy.
I mean, it's so interesting. I've heard of lots of different therapies over the years, equine therapy, EMDR, art therapy, psychodrama, somatic release. I mean, and we've even talked about all these different kinds of therapies on the podcast, but I've actually never heard of internal family systems. And the concept of it, I mean, I find it so interesting. I guess my next question is, how do you identify the different almost internal members of your family? I mean, how do you connect with them, and how do you communicate with them?
That's a good question. So usually a person comes into therapy presenting a problem that they want solved. And the problem that they want solved might be, I have trouble with rage, let's say. I have trouble with rage. And so it's so what you're doing initially is you're trying to get them to be able to notice what their internal experience is. So what do you sense? It still has a lot of mindfulness associated. Like, how would you know you're rageful? You know what I mean? Where do you locate that? Is there an experience in your body, some sensations that tell you that you're rageful? Then going along with that, are there any messages you hear when you're rageful? And any images, anything that would help the person be able to locate this experience, to become sensitive to noticing when they're rageful. And what happens generally when they start to notice the rageful experience, the therapist often will say, well, how do you feel towards that part of you that you notice that's rageful? And often what will happen is they'll not hear some of those nice things I said that Richard Schwartz noticed, things like compassion, curiosity, connectedness, that kind of thing. What they'll hear is something like, I don't like him. I don't like that this creates so much trouble. My marriage is at risk, blah, blah, blah. And then when that happens in therapy, what you're doing is you're asking the client, does that seem like that's that same rageful part? Or does that seem like that's something else that has another opinion about this? And the person will say, well, it doesn't sound like it's the rageful part. It's because it doesn't like the rageful part. Oh, okay, then maybe that's another part, right? And so what you're doing initially is you're trying to get the client to be sensitive to what's going on, aware of what's happening inside of them, so they can start to see that they have a variety of experiences that go along with any kind of circumstance. It could be one that shows up at the same thing and feels, well, I feel alone. When I feel another feeling of aloneness, because when he gets angry, then people leave me and then I feel all alone. Oh, there was another part. This is a part of you that feels loneliness, So they're starting to learn about the parts. And what happens very interestingly is eventually, after you've addressed the parts, and when you're addressing the parts, you're basically trying to hear from them, as I gave in the example, like, why do you do this? Like, how are you trying to help Elizabeth, or how are you trying to help Tom, by doing this? And they'll tell you. And once they feel listened to, a lot of times they'll quiet down, and you can go back to the original target, which might be the rageful part. So when that happens, often when the client and the therapist says, well, can you check now and see how you feel towards the part? And a lot of times what will happen automatically is the person will say, well, I don't know, I guess I'm kind of curious about why it does this, right? And that's a good sign, because what that means is that the person's core self, I call it the core self, that groundedness that Richard Schwartz discovered, he calls that the self, right? I call it the core self, same thing. And the core self has characteristics like connectedness, calm, courageous, compassionate, things like that. So what he notices, and what the client will notice, is that their core self showed up, right? And so that's one of the outcomes you're hoping for the client, is that they will start to distinguish between their parts and their core self, and that they will start to know that their core self doesn't have to be created. The core self is there. It's innate. It's in all of us when we're born. So give an example I give to my clients. I said, think of it like this. So what you are is an extraterrestrial comes to Earth, and you're given the job, Elizabeth is given the job of being the tour guide for the extraterrestrial. So you go outside, and he looks up at the sky, and he points to the sun, and he says, what's that? And you say, well, that's the sun. Well, what's the purpose of that? What's the good of that? And you would say, well, it keeps me warm, helps people see more clearly, makes you feel really good. Oh, okay, good. So you go to bed that night, and before you get up in the morning, the extraterrestrial gets out. You slept in, so it's like 10 o'clock in the morning, and he looks up and then he runs in the house and he says, Elizabeth, you got a problem. What do you mean I got a problem? Come here, come here. And he takes her outside and he looks up, points up at the sky and says, your son is gone. I don't see your son at all. And of course, you know what the problem is, right? It's really not a problem. All that's happened is clouds, either one big cloud or multiple clouds have joined together to block the sun, right? And so in IFS, what we're doing is we're paying attention from the therapist-centered place. From the therapist has a self too. From the therapist self place, a grounded, connected, compassionate place, each of those clouds gets to get listened to. And when it does, it becomes agreeable to parting, to kind of moving apart. Mm-hmm. And when that happens, what happens inside of the person is their own self appears. And so Richard Schwartz, when I first was learning about this a number of years ago, I looked up to find out about his website, and his website was called the Center for Self-Leadership. And I thought, what the heck is that? Yeah. Like teaching people self-confidence or something? And what I learned was what it is, it's encouraging a life where your life is being led by your core self, not by your parts that might flood you at any particular moment. So instead of having your life run by a rage part, let's say, that floods you in the moment, it's becoming attentive enough to that part that yourself can appear. So it's it's a very optimistic kind of therapy.
So I remember a few years ago, a movie came out called Inside Out.
Inside Out. That's exactly where my brain went.
And
yeah, I've bought copies of that, and I lend it to my clients when they come. You know what I mean? They first come in.
Is it kind of like that? And then
exactly.
Living the core self life is not necessarily being run by joy or anger or sadness. It's almost like the opposite of that, where like your core self, I mean, so in the movie, I think like family was one of the core pieces. Like her love of like sports was a core piece. Her love of being silly was a core piece. So it's almost the opposite. Instead of joy and anger, it's letting those core towers or core pieces of you lead your life.
That's right. Exactly. That's why it's a really good video. And just to stress again that sometimes people think that we're trying to create a better ego in front of the person, or a more effective ego. We're not trying to create anything. God gave us this innate mental health, right? And that innate mental health is never destroyed. It gets covered over, by parts that have to try to protect us from abuse and trauma and all sorts of things, the kind of environment we grew up that might have been just unsafe in a lot of ways, right? So we're not trying to create it. It's a subtractive process. You're noticing enough so they're willing to part for the parts to separate, right? The other thing that's really useful in that video, I remember I've seen it a couple times, but one of the things I thought was kind of funny was later in the movie, they show how everybody has parts. The mom has her parts, the father has his parts that make him operate in a way that is not, quote, self-led. Even the dog had parts. So this is really helpful because I also do couples counseling, right? And you can apply these concepts in all your types of therapy, I would say, is that in couples counseling, the reason why it doesn't go very well is why their relationship isn't going really well is because one person's protective part over here that's trying to protect them from being injured is communicating with someone else's protective part over here that's trying to protect them from being injured. So this one over here might blame to try to get some attention so that maybe the person will come and pay attention to them and notice how they're hurting and have a connected feeling. And this one over here, when it's being blamed, can't stand it, so wants to get away. So you have two parts that are both trying to protect, and the way they interact is one attacks and the other one runs away, which means you're not going to have any connection. So knowing that your partner has parts and that what you might be looking at is not their core self, you might be looking at just a protective part that's jumping in to try to protect them from some attachment injury, like being left or betrayed or alone or sad or something, right? And so and that's a good awareness. Once you start realizing that, then you stop ascribing to the other person all these negative intents. You start to have compassion for your partner, which makes the communication more possible. So that's really, really a plus. And I encourage my couples that when they're trying to tell their wife or their husband or their partner how they feel, to not say I feel like leaving the relationship, right? What I ask them to do is use parts language to say something like, sometimes I feel like leaving the relationship because I get so scared. And they tell me that when they use the word a part of me rather than I feel, say a part of me feels rather than I feel, is significant for them. And you can imagine why that is.
And one of the things that I'm kind of curious about, I mean, right now we're all sort of trapped at home. We've all been told to basically shelter in place, don't go out unless you absolutely have to. But with that being said, I'm kind of been following the reports of domestic violence, and they're kind of on the rise. I mean, in that kind of situation, do you try to talk to the person who's perhaps abusing you in that same language, or is there a point when, I mean, like that it's just unhealthy and you just get out?
So in other words, you're talking about the conversation that the victim might have with the perpetrator?
Yes.
Yeah. So first of all, I wouldn't encourage them to have that conversation without the help of a therapist. I think, because there's a reason why the perpetrator is doing what he's doing. It's obviously not helpful. I mean, not helpful. That's an understatement. Why it's terrible, right? It doesn't make any sense what the person's doing, because they're hurting a person probably that they love dearly, right? So if trying to have that conversation before they've been in therapy together, or maybe therapy alone, first of all, would probably make let's say the victim is talking to the perpetrator in that way, and trying to explain to him or whatever, how it doesn't make any sense and you're really hurting me, and my guess is that it would make the perpetrator feel blamed, or wouldn't make the perpetrator feel safe, put it that way, and that some protector inside the perpetrator would pop up, which you would hope wouldn't be the violent part, but it could be. So I think what they would want to do is work individually first before they even work as a couple, so that perpetrator could try to understand, what is the injury or the fear that I'm going to say the perpetrator is a man, because most of the time it is. It might not be, but let's say it is. So that the perpetrator must have some sort of fear inside of him that he has learned to act out in anger towards people who might abandon him or might treat him as if he doesn't matter, or as if he's not cared for. He might have learned that he might have rage from when he was very little that happened. So there would need to be a lot of therapy done with him to try to get him to the place where he's healed a bunch of that hurt, so that he might feel the rage coming up, but the intensity of it would be not so much that he wouldn't be able to control it, and that he might actually have perspective. And so another thing in this kind of therapy is you're encouraging the client to build a relationship between their core self and their parts, so that the parts are so familiar with that core self. And I encourage people to do this on a daily basis at home as part of their routine, to have a connecting moment between the self and the parts, so that in the moment, in a tough moment, that part would notice that they are in the presence of their core self, and that everything's going to be okay. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's what I would recommend.
I think so. So we only have a few minutes left, but I just wondered, you mentioned that you recommend connecting with your core self every day, making it a practice. Could
Hmm.
you leave us with some tips on how to connect with your core self, or a practice that you suggest to your clients as they come in every day?
Yeah, so often we get to the point where the client is in touch with a tender part of them, a very sensitive part of them. And so I encourage them to take that sensitive and often, it's a very young part, like a 5-year-old or something, who was hurt at one time. And I ask them to picture that 5-year-old and and see if there's a place where that 5-year-old would like you to take her, that where she would feel safe with you. And then I encourage them to visualize themselves going to that place and noticing everything about the place, trying to make it have a sensory kind of thing. What do they see? What are the colors? What do they smell? What do they touch? That kind of thing. And then see if they have this inspiration about what that child needs from you. Does she need you to sit beside her or kneel down in front of her and hold her, or what does she need? And to visualize that, and maybe what you'll feel inspired about some words that she needs to hear, or maybe you'll be, maybe the first thing is you would notice how she feels, and you could validate why you could understand why she would feel that way. So there's a saying, with teenagers, that they don't want to hear what you say they don't care what you think until they know that you care, right? So the first piece is to show you care by bringing the child to that safe place, asking her what she's feeling, validating that so that she feels heard, and then reassuring her with some sort of comfort. And I often encourage them to do a physical cue, like they might put their hand on their heart, wherever some sort of a cue, and practice that cue so that, in a situation in the moment where they need to feel that peace or something, they can just put that cue into play and they'll automatically go back to that experience. So I think that's very, very important. Very, very important.
I love that. So, for everyone out there, we do live in crazy times right now with all of us being, at home or isolated or stuck in quarantine. I love this practice that Thomas has shared with us today about being mindful, about having a physical cue to take you back to that tender, sensitive part of yourself and really providing comfort to it. I think that's a practice I want to start trying myself
Yeah.
every day, because especially right now where stress is high and my kids are getting more and more wild by the day due to pent up isolation and pent up energy. I think that is a really powerful practice for all of us to do. And I also really, really appreciate what Tom acknowledged, that if you are in a potentially abusive situation, don't try to take on those conversations right now with yourself. Definitely get help. Definitely reach out to a counselor, to someone who is trained, who can help you have those conversations, or help you get to the point to where maybe you're ready to have both of you come in and have this conversation with the help of a counselor. So with that being said, I want to say thank you so much. It was so interesting today. I feel like I learned so much because, like I said at the beginning, I had never even heard of internal family systems. And I think that's, it's just kind of opened my mind and brought a whole new level to the movie Inside Out. So maybe if you're bored at home, you should go check out that movie Inside Out.
Definitely.
With that being said, I want to say thank you, Tom, again so much for your time. It's been wonderful talking to you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for tuning in today. We hope to catch you again next time on Smart Talks. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.